And now we're proud to announce we've found a brand new monster.
A new one?
Magmascar.
Oh, that sounds awesome!
Rathalos.
Did you say Rathalos?
Yes, Magmascar Rathalos.
That's not a brand new monster.
Yes, of course it is. Rathalos doesn't normally have a Magmascar.
Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, I've been doing some math recently, and that math led me to an interesting discovery. One I thought worth sharing with you all and discussing a little bit about a couple of points. First up, there are 216 large monsters in main series Monster Hunter games. That means we are only counting the numbered titles, Generations Ultimate, World, Iceborne, Rise, Sunbreak, and also Freedom and Freedom Unite, of course. 216 large monsters. That's a pretty hefty number, right? Not bad at all by my estimation for 5 generations of monsters. Every generation is made up of a few different games and expansions, and each game and expansion has its own sort of poster child, a flagship by the official name. Usually these are the monsters displayed on the cover of the game itself, but sometimes the developers specifically state that they consider certain monsters to be flagships within the game that don't grace the cover itself. In any case, regardless of game covers, these are considered to be staple fights of these games. They are big and important to the story. The fights themselves are made to leave a significant impression on you and make you more connected to those monsters than most other monsters in the game. And a lot of the time, it works pretty well. I'd say on average, if you ask like 1,000 people what their favorite monster is, more of the answers you'd get would be flagships than non-flagships, which would be pretty impressive, right? I mean, one monster per game, and that means that they must have been chosen quite well, right? Well, that is until you realize the next part of this. There are 5 Rathalos, including their variations, 3 Kushala Daoras, 4 Tigrex, 4 Nargacugas, 3 Lagiacrus, 4 Zinogres, 2 Brachydios, 4 Gore Magalas if we include Shagaru, which I do, 1 Seregios, the poor little guy, 2 Espinas, 3 Glavenus, 4 Mizutsune, 2 Gammoth, 2 Astalos, 3 Valstrax, 4 Diablos as variations of Bloodbath, 2 Nergigantes, 1 Velkhana, 2 Magnamalos, and 1 Malzeno. That's 56 flagships and variations of the flagships in the main series. Every single one of those counted toward that number of 216 large monsters in the main series as a whole. Add on to that I didn't count Monoblos as Diablos variations, or Rathians as Rathalos variations, and if I did, that would make it 63 total out of 216. That means depending on how you choose to count them, flagships, flagship subspecies, variants, deviants, apexes, risen, rare species, just general variations, they make up anywhere from 26 to 29% of all large monsters in the main series, and that is actually sort of nuts when you think about it. These monsters are designed to be memorable experiences in a vacuum, but if you make then just tons of variations for them to add to the games as well, then they sort of have to be memorable, because you are never really without them. Of course, they will be the majority of people's favorite monsters in some way, shape, or form, because they make up more than a quarter of the roster as a whole. And so the question is, what has this really done to the series? In the first couple of generations, the flagship monster was a position of real, genuine importance. It told you that a monster was going to be a hell of a fight when you got to it, and it really had an impact. But as the games have gone on further and further, that has sort of been left behind a little bit. Yes, they still have story importance, but quite often they get overshadowed pretty easily because of the way that they're designed, and I have to wonder if the reason for that is because the developers are fully aware that they are going to make variations of these monsters and thus choose not to go all out on the base version. For example, don't get me wrong, Nergigante in Monster Hunter World is a fantastic monster, one of my favorites really, and my personal favorite flagship too, but I said the whole time that he should have had bleed as a status, just logically speaking. He shoots spikes at you, the spikes impale you, making big holes, and if that would happen to you, you should probably be bleeding, right? It just sort of makes sense, but yep, they didn't do it. Then we got Ruiner Nergigante in Iceborne and he applied bleed. At the time, I was just happy about it. I loved Ruiner Nergigante and it made me happy, but now looking back at it, maybe that just should have been part of the kit of base Nergigante, and maybe they left it out knowing that they were going to make Ruiner Nergigante afterwards, which brings the big question here. With 26 to 29% of all large monsters in the series being flagships and their variations, does the title of flagship really mean as much as it once did? Has the concept been diluted? Are they even all that special anymore in their own right just because of that title?
You're asking a lot of questions.
The short answer for me at least is yes, they are still special, but if anything it is the reason that they're special that has changed. In early games a flagship used to represent a big important fight, a wall that might get you stuck for a bit, something that you'd remember for the combat more than anything, and it was a monster that the developers thought was awesome. These days the Monster Hunter games have actual proper stories to them, some of them are pretty decent stories as well, and so the flagship position has simply sort of changed its meaning. Now a flagship is just a monster that either holds the most important singular place in a story, or the monster who will show up multiple times, just the most often throughout the story. They're a sort of linchpin of the events in that region. Not the final boss, of course, that's always been hidden and locked away for your first experience, but in the new era these flagships are sort of used as a vessel for storytelling, and I quite like that personally. But again, here comes the question. Does this make the concept of flagship less meaningful about the monster as a whole? At the end of the day, I've always, and I mean always, been an advocate that subspecies and general monster variations are definitely interesting, but a little bit overdone for me. There are tons of variants and subspecies that I think would be better off getting a model redesign and then just being considered an entirely new monster, and I think that could apply to a lot of the general flagship monsters too. When you have a monster variation, oftentimes they are crafted in a way where they have to be more interesting than the base monster, because if they aren't, then what's the point, really? Why take a monster that people love and make a worse version, right? I'm looking at you as a Rathalos. But by doing so with flagships, you make the initial flagship itself seem less interesting by giving us a cooler comparison. Magnamalo is alright, but Scorned Magnamalo is really freaking cool, and it sort of makes me feel like Magnamalo itself isn't as good just because we've seen Scorned, and they made Scorned so soon after. It's a bit of a weird thing to talk about, really, because the title of flagship itself is a bit of an abstract thing, honestly. Yes, it is placed on certain monsters for a specific reason, but it's not like it makes the monster stronger by having it. It's not like it makes the monster better just by having that title. It just sort of signifies a certain importance within the game. But there's definitely an argument to be made that this importance that they want these monsters to have is being unnecessarily diluted by making so many different versions of the flagship monsters. And when it comes to the point where, again, flagships and their variations make up 26 to 29% of all the large monsters in the entirety of the main series, how special is the title even anymore? It's not an easy thing to answer. There's no real definitive yes or no answer. There's no simple way to fix it if you think it's a problem either, but I consider it something interesting to think about for sure once I worked out these numbers. Somehow, as time has gone on, flagship monsters as a concept have both gotten more and less important. More actual hold on your experience and journey through the game that they are the flagship of themselves, but less actual individual meaning as a fight and even as a monster outside of how they flow into the story itself. Then there is the fact of the flagships themselves. For their time, things like Rathalos, Tigrex, Nargacuga, they were all incredibly unique creatures and incredibly well received too. Then you get into the more recent era and it gets super divisive. Nergigante is considered one of the best monsters around by most people, but then Iceborne had Velkhana, who some people love and some people hate. Very 50-50 even on a good day. Then Base Rise had Magnamalo, who again, some people love and some people hate, and then Sunbreak has Malzeno, who is generally very well received across the board. These days the flagships seem a bit hit and miss as to whether people love them or not, but as I've been saying, I think a big part of that is because the quantifier for what decides a flagship has also changed. Tigrex was a flagship because they fully believed in his design and his fight, and it stood up to that entirely. Velkhana is a flagship because she is integral to the story of Iceborne to the point where the expansion simply wouldn't make any logical sense without her being there to drive it forwards. But that doesn't say anything about her actual fight, you know what I mean? And so as we move forward, there is one question left. Will anything be done to change any of this? Or is this just what being a flagship monster is now? Will Monster Hunter 6 have a flagship that is chosen simply because of story importance, or will it be chosen for having one of the coolest designs and fights in the game? Ideally, of course, it would be a mix of the two, like something like Gore Magala, an incredible creature that is extremely relevant to the story of the game too. But even then, how long will it be until we have a subspecies or a variant of that monster, maybe even two? And will that dampen the memory and experience of the original? I don't know, not for certain. After all, these types of things affect each of us differently and we all have our own thoughts on the matters, but I just thought this was a fun thing to bring up and talk about once I'd run the numbers. 216 main series large monsters, 56 to 63 flagships and variations depending on what you count. Those numbers are striking to me. It's straight up crazy to me, and it was far from what I thought was true in the back of my head before I went to check it out. And yep, that is the case. What are your thoughts on this? Should we have less flagship variations? Should the concept of what makes a monster a flagship be changed? How do you think this changes your experience in the games as a whole, if it changes it at all? Like if you liked the video, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.